So,
I'm so excited.
yeah, technology has its shortcomings.
Yes, it does.
So we are recording, and I'm so excited that we are having our first sit-down video session together.
I am excited as well.
And I'm going to kick us off by introducing myself and talking a little bit about why I decided that you needed to be on the line with me today to have this conversation. And then I'm going to pass it off to you so you can tell our audience why you're on the line with me.
Okay, all right.
So my name is Kina Reed. I'm the Director of Forensics at Louisiana State University. And I'm also a full-time faculty instructor in the Communication Studies Department. And I have recently curated the Anti-Blackness Reader project. And so what I'm doing with that project is taking my 15 years of academic experience, and that includes teaching, research service, and trying to find a way to connect it to a larger audience, more specifically Black people, in terms of how to understand the role of anti-Blackness in our lives, in our systems, in our institutions, and in our social norms. Because I think that oftentimes when we're talking about institutional violence or systems of violence towards all people, but specifically Black people, that a lot of times Black people are not at the table for those conversations, okay? And so I've seen it way too many times where people are talking about us, but I'm the only us in the room. And so because of that, I felt like it was really important to kind of extend this conversation. What I've been telling people is that I am trying to enlarge and expand my classroom. And I think that there's no way to have a full conversation about anti-Blackness without actually talking about the term Black. I know, grass pearls. Yeah. So now, you already know who I am, but tell my audience who you are and how you're great.
All right. So my name is Bedelia Richards. I am an associate professor at University of Richmond, which is a small, historically white institution. I'm also the founder of RaceTalk LLC, which is my consulting business, yes, that offers, do consulting work. I offer workshops to administrators, faculty, and student leaders, and how to engage in conversations about race. I'm also, post-tenure, really kind of committing myself to being a publicly engaged scholar. So that is part of what brings me here to have this conversation with you. One of the things that also brings me here too is that, this is an issue that I have been thinking about for a very long time, and actually planning to write about, because I think that language is important in naming things, right?
Yes, for sure.
Right, at kind of identifying it. And in my work as a professor, I've really noticed how my students and also colleagues, right, seem to be so evasive around using the B word. Oh. And I'm like wondering, what is it? So I'm gonna, I love telling stories. I think stories are powerful. So I'll give, this past, I think it was this past year actually. No, this has happened, this is something that's been an ongoing issue, but I always assumed that when my students did it, that it was just a kind of generalized manifestation of the society we live in, which is aspires to be very colorblind. So I really just assumed that this was just one of those manifestations, but I was genuinely shocked to have my white students tell me that their K-12 teachers tell them that Black is offensive.
Wow.
And they should not use it. And I was just like, whoa. Right? That was like a big thing for me, right?
Yeah. I can imagine it
like one of many experiences.
Okay.
The other I think I had shared with you was just like mind-blowing is a conversation that I had a few years ago with a non-Black colleague. And this non-Black colleague proceeded to tell me that my use of the word Black was offensive, right?
Wow.
You know, I'm, you know, kind of similar to using the R word for Native Americans and the Y word, yellow, right? To talk about Asian Americans. And I was just like, did this person not miss the fact that they are telling a Black person how to name themselves, right? Like, you are an expert on the label that I use to define myself? Really? Like, that was completely missing, right, from that person's consciousness, right? And I don't want to just kind of leave this hanging. So let me just say, you know, for the record, right, it is offensive to use the Y word for Asian Americans, but that's because there is a history, a racist history associated with this terminology, right, of thinking about you know, Asian American immigrants, Chinese immigrants in particular, right, as kind of yellow peril, right? And it wasn't, Chinese immigrants didn't choose to define themselves in this way. So that's why, yes, that is racist and that is inappropriate, right? It is inappropriate.
Yeah, for sure.
Right, to refer to Native people, First Nations people, right? But, and calling, you know, referring to them as red, because that is not a word that they themselves use to identify themselves, right? And it also has racist connotations, you know, related to, you know, their history. But with the word Black, we use it, right?
Yes.
This is a reflection of our agency. And I think that colleague had good intentions, but failed to kind of, you know, take into consideration the history of the different words and how the groups themselves, right, use and appropriate those terms. So bottom line, this is something that I've been thinking about a lot. And so thank you so much for inviting me to have this conversation with you. I told you that I've really admired, you know, you on Facebook, and, you know, we seem to have a lot of things in common, but also that we, you know, like you challenge me as well, right? And I like that. So I'm really excited to have this conversation with you.
Yay. I also want to apologize. When we go back to the recording, there might be a moment where you're upside down or I'm upside down.
You look upside down, but I don't know what it looks like on the recording.
So for all the viewers, that's not on Bedelia, that's on Kina. I am not a director. That is not one of my skill sets. So, you know, let's start with like kind of the first position, which is like, what do we think the term Black, how do we think that that term Black in association with Blackness has evolved historically, not just here in the United States, but elsewhere? Because I do feel like we're at a time where maybe what it means now in 2020 might not be what it meant like in maybe even 1960, right?
You know, when I think about how it has evolved, I'm thinking I'll start kind of like in the US. And I think when I think about Blackness in the US, it's hard to divorce it from slavery, right? Or another way of thinking about it, like in the classroom context, like when we, and I do this sometimes, like, what do you think about when you think about, you know, slavery? Immediately Black folks, right? And to have to kind of unpack that. You know, slavery has existed in many societies, different time periods, right? But the fact is, right, the way in which we think about it in the US in particular is those two things are thought about kind of like hand in hand, right?
Yes, synonymously,
right? And I think part of that is that the way in which kind of racism or anti-Black racism was used to justify racial oppression or justify enslavement and genocide and so on, that is kind of like the, you know, the root, so the root cause of like, you know, we need these people for this labor, and so we need to kind of like justify why we have selected these folks, right? And so I think that historically is really kind of interconnected with that ideology of you're less than. And we know that that took time to kind of evolve, right? It wasn't, you know, it didn't start out automatically that way. When we think about like the first, maybe not the first, but, you know, when we usually think about the kind of 1619 date that we usually use for kind of Black folks or African.
Which isn't entirely accurate, but that is not the conversation we're
right.
having.
Yeah, something what we use, right? Which is why I said this is what we use,
exactly.
Right? That even at that point, we're talking about religion, right, being used to kind of the language being used to define who these people are, right? So my point is that it wasn't just kind of like automatic. It took time for these categories to kind of solidify. But in where we are now, right, and we, in the context of the U.S., I think, it would be hard to think about Blackness without also thinking about kind of the one drop rule, right?
Yeah.
About, regardless of, what skin tone you look like, right? You had a, one drop of Black blood, then you are defined, kind of.
Yeah.
So I think in the U.S., I think about all of these kinds of historical events that slowly solidified what it means to be Black. And I think, again, like slavery is kind of a root part of that. And part of it was also that Blackness historically in the US then, because, if we think about it, because it's rooted in kind of slavery and anti-Black ideology, is then signifying kind of like the base, right, of the US kind of racial hierarchy, or who are the people who are at the lowest social status, right?
Yes.
And so, historically then, so it's kind of like, how do we know who is white? Well, we got to know who's Black first, right?
Yeah,
start
there. Start there.
Right, like they're the bad stuff, all the things you don't want to be, and then white is all the good stuff. And so historically we've seen that when, racialized immigrants have attempted to become white or fit into whiteness or be adjacent or have some of the privileges of whiteness, that historically what they have done is to distance themselves from what it means to be Black, right?
Yeah.
So anyway, so those are some of the, in terms of the US, like those are some of the things that I've kind of think about that has solidified again over time what it means to be Black. And I think in terms of the diaspora, I think the one drop.
Right, before we get to the diaspora, can I also add some things to the US context?
Yes.
I think as being someone who has taught about these things in classrooms, across the South, I fully agree with you. Like the first time that most people even see Black people show up when we're talking about K through 12 education in this country is when the conversation is around slavery.
Yeah.
Right? Like, they've been, first, second graders, they start, taking geography classes, history classes. Well, that happens, I'm sorry, that's not happening in first and second grade. I think it's like third grade, fourth grade. But when Black people show up, they show up enslaved.
Yeah. Right.
Right. And I've spent a lot of time thinking about what does that even mean for Black children.
Right.
That, right. Like I show up in a textbook finally, but I'm, enslaved. So I think you're right. I think there are all these different moments where Black and slave is synonymous. And I also think it's important to recognize that anti-Blackness ideology was present way before racism was. And I think a lot of people struggle with that, right? But anti-Blackness, it's like, what came first, the chicken or the egg? And I'm going to always argue anti-Blackness was here first. And that's what allowed for the enslavement of people. And so I just, wanted to solidify that I totally agree with you about that position, that understanding of Blackness and subjugation and disempowerment and slavery, people don't know how to separate them, right? And then, the Afro-pessimists will tell us, and they're theorizing that the barometer to discover who is human really does fall upon us. Like, and I mean, we can go on that, but like all of the things you said just completely affirm my own position. And I think now as you start to talk about what Blackness means outside of the United States, I think you're really primed to talk about that in ways that I'm not. So go ahead.
In some ways it was harder for me I can speak, I can talk about that, but I think because, when I teach, my teaching is more in the US context, it was in some ways easier in that way. But as I think about, because I'm from Jamaica, and as I think about even my own Blackness and evolution into Blackness, I could also talk about my own experiences. And I think within the US, I think that slavery also, right? Or rather, when I think about the diaspora, I'm thinking about people's connection to Africa as maybe being the defining thing. Like slavery, yes, because it's, you know, slavery is also like, when did we get pulled, you know, away from this place?
For sure.
Right?
Yeah.
And enslaved somewhere else. So I think it is slavery, but it's more like, what is my connection to Africa? But I think in the diaspora, that connection, let me speak specifically as like a Black Jamaican, like that connection is not necessarily a negative one, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's also kind of, I'm kind of getting into something else. But I think, you know, for other people, right? I think Africa serves a kind of role in marking low status in kind of globally.
In the
way
global
that
community,
kind of
yes.
slavery affords kind of low status to Black folks in the US. So I think that's how we have this kind of globalized anti-Blackness. Like I remember when I was in college and I studied abroad in Spain, and you know, these little children were having conversations with me about, you know, the poor kids in Africa and, you know, how sad and, you know, they are that is happening. And I'm just like, what does that have to do with me in a way, right? Like this is the lens through which. So I think for me, I think in the diaspora, like within Black communities and the kind of throughout the world, then one's connection to Africa, I think, is what shapes that. But I also think that again, so two different ideas, and thinking about kind of my own identity in predominantly Black spaces, let's say like Jamaica, I think our identities that are most kind of salient are like our Jamaican identity, right?
Yeah.
But I think when I say that, some people might think that what does that mean, that you don't identify as Black, right? Yeah, but I think that's something that's more taken for granted because we have the luxury of taking it for granted because everybody around us, right?
Yeah.
For the most part, right? Look Black. Or, you know, and so on. So I don't think it's a thing of not identifying as, it's just not something that is salient in the way that when you're in a predominantly white space, you're super conscious, right?
Yeah.
Of your Blackness. And I know the way that you know, I have a very strong and salient Jamaican identity. I also have a very strong and salient Black identity. There wasn't a time that I never thought of myself as Black, but the meaning that's associated with that Blackness has evolved, and that awareness and consciousness of how it functions has evolved. And as I will tell people, you know, I have a very strong Jamaican identity, but when it comes to the racism that I have experienced in academia, they weren't discriminating against me because I'm Jamaican.
Yes, for sure.
The basis of being a Black woman. And that has shaped that kind of racial consciousness, right? That may not have been fully developed, right, when I first migrated to the US. And so I don't know if that kind of gets at some of that stuff.
Yeah. And I also think it's really interesting to talk about the ways in which race as a signifier, as an identity marker, exists in the United States in ways that it doesn't exist other places, right? Mm-hmm. And that's something I often have to teach my students, like, hey, no one's having conversations about race in North Korea, right? Like, you know what I'm saying? Like, there, the concept of like nationality is so strong, you know, and parts of, you know, South America. I mean, Brazil, there's definitely a huge racial kind of identity construction there, but other places where everyone, like you said, where people tend to all look like each other, then that racial dynamic has a different, it's shaped different. It moves a lot differently. I think it's important that we recognize, though, that Black exists outside of the US, and it means different things outside of the US. So do you think that—
Can I add one more thing though? May I add one more thing though? Because I think this is important. Like, especially because I gave this example of what Blackness means in terms of this kind of negative portrayal of Africa. Because I think it's really important, especially for white folks, to be honest, to realize that Black people also have very positive associations.
Yes, but we're going to talk about those positive associations later.
Okay. All right.
Let me be Oprah, okay?
Okay.
You be Gail, I'll be Oprah. No, I'm just joking. But like, how do we think Blackness functions as an identity marker, or even how as a rhetorical tool in the United States? Because I see it as both of those things. For example, I feel like as a rhetorical tool, oftentimes people use Black in the news coverage to, without saying anything, right, imply a certain level of aggression or deviance. You get what I'm saying? Because like if you read a news story about a perpetrator who stole a car, right? If most of the time, if that person is white, there is no racial marker there.
That's usually how I know they're white.
That's usually how I know they're white.
I was like, yeah, that's a white person.
I did it, right? Because it's like the car theft happened on 23rd and Oak, and the thief left
perpetrator, yes, perpetrator, not the right? Black perpetrator.
But when it's a Black person, it's like insert black,
and
so
a picture.
Yes, exactly.
So right? You usually don't even have to say the word because the picture is there.
Yeah.
Criminal.
So I feel like Black therefore has a rhetorical purpose, because what it's doing is reminding readers or listeners, now imagine all the stuff you know about Black folks, right? So I feel like it has a rhetorical function in society. I also think it's it's an identity marker. I feel like, I don't know necessarily when I knew I was Black, right? I don't know if I ever had this moment, but I definitely know people call me Black, right? Like, that is your identity. So even if I didn't necessarily say, this is who I identify as a Black woman, someone told me I was a Black woman way before I even knew to call that to myself. So that's what I mean when I say Black being a rhetorical tool or even an identity marker. Do you feel like that Black does function in those regards?
I think that there are many ways that Black functions. I think that in the US imagination, on the one hand, it functions to signify kind of negative attributes. And I know we're going to get to this, but I think that's also why maybe some folks might prefer to say African American, but that's, we'll get to that later. But I also think that in the white imagination in particular, Blackness signifies radical, right? Yeah. And so it's kind of
Black power.
Yeah, right. Which in our communities may have a different kind of meaning, like a positive, meaning. But in mainstream white America, that signifies something else. And I'm just thinking about students at my university who are now advocating for an Africana Studies, department or program. I don't remember which one. And they wrote an amazing proposal, to advocate for this. And one of the things they put in the proposal is that they did their research and realized that Black studies programs were not funded to the same extent as those who were named, like Africana Studies, right? So to me, that's also like an example of how Blackness functions, right? Not just even as a rhetorical tool, but right, like kind of a symbol, right? And why is it that for donors that is Africana Studies?
Yeah, that's much more sophisticated. It's much more.
Yeah, it would be something that they're more willing to fund than a Black studies. So I think they have this kind of like militant, I think.
And they wouldn't fund the urban studies.
I don't know. Okay, So anyway, it also, but anyway, so I think, I'll just leave it there because I think some of the things we'll kind of build on as conversation.
Well, and also the idea that going back to what I said about like the ways in which even before I identified as Black, I was socially defined as Black, right? What does that mean? And you mentioned earlier about like the three, in terms of enslavement, the 3/5 rule, or the 1-drop rule, excuse me, I'm thinking about the 3/5 compromise. I'm mixed up.
That's important too, because it's the same property, but
that's a whole other thing, but the 1-drop rule. And so what does it mean that, I mean, I'm being real, even though it seems farcical, that there were biracial kids on the plantation who's like, look, that's my daddy, right? Or at least, right? Like, he's one of the white guys who created the children, but being socially defined as Black, right? Meaning having other people say, you're Black and that's who you are. Like, what does that do for us in society? What does it do for us in institutions? You get what I'm saying? Like, even if you're not someone who identifies as Black, but people out here in these streets telling you, hey, guess what? But you Black though. What does that mean for us?
I'm thinking back to, this may not really answer your question, but that's just what's resonating with me right now.
Yeah.
I'm thinking about what you just said about being on a plantation, being, you know, socially defined as Black, and knowing that, you know, that's your daddy. And I'm just like, that is deep. Like, that is deep. Like, you, and what does it take for you to be able to look at your child? And what kind of mental gymnastics, like, what do you have to do in order to dehumanize and think, I just can't wrap my head around, how do you have your child, you know, enslaved and not feel any kind, I mean, that's where the dehumanization, you know, that's part of that dehumanization. Because if you can do that to your own child.
Yeah, flesh and blood. Well, I feel like that's gonna have to be our second conversation, because you're right. That is a whole different thing altogether.
Yeah, but here's the thing. I think that is really a metaphor for like white people and Black folks in this country. Because literally, like, if you think about it, our family, right? And not just in a broad abstract way. Like, I know, you know, a few, like at least 2 or so African American friends who literally have family that they know who are white, right? But someone passed, right?
And they were like, we're gonna let you do it.
I went that direction, and somebody didn't know, like, that grandma, you know, was really, really Black, right? And comes back, and it's mind blowing to me. So we have, you know, to think about, like, you know, one of these little, you know, white students in my classes who may literally be sitting next to a family member.
Yeah.
I mean, but that's it. You can literally see yourselves as not related, but if you actually think about the history, like that's what it is.
Yeah, right? And I think it means, I mean, it shows the power of those social definitions too, that the master, once deciding that that kid was Black and only Black, or Black and only a slave, then there's a way to, once you put that label on someone, then it's that much easier to dehumanize them and to subjugate them and to disempower them. So I think part of that switch has to be like, yeah, I'm looking at an enslaved kid that has my nose,
right?
But they're Black.
Yeah.
And even as people who teach at higher institutions, higher education institutions, like I often wonder, I mean, not so much now, but definitely early in my teaching career, like, you know, I know that I've had some students who are not Black who knew I was Black before the class. Because maybe, well, first of all, I rate my professor the ways that it's implied.
Right.
But like conversations that students have. And so I wonder if they're walking into those spaces with expectations about who I am just based off of the one word. You know, I always like wondered, like, what narrative am I already playing against before I get to show them who I am? Right. Let's go back to, because I do think it's important to recognize that there's positive and negative engagement around the term Black, right? So for me, I think the first taste of that positive engagement was 7th grade. I read the autobiography of Malcolm X. And I laugh and tell people I think I read it too early. Like maybe I was supposed to read it like in high school. But I feel like that was the first time I saw that term in such a powerful light. Like I was like, whoa, like this is the kind of stuff that Black people do, you know? Because I grew up in I grew up in New York, but we moved to Central Louisiana right at the beginning of my teens, and it was a very racist town that I lived in. And so what I saw around me is Black meaning disempowered, living on this side of the railroad track. But when I picked up that book, Black meant something completely different.
Mm-hmm.
So I know you too feel like there's a lot of positive engagement and connection to the term as well.
Yeah, I do. And as I'm thinking about it, for me, because I grew up in Jamaica and I came to the US when I was about 12. So it's hard, like, and so when I was in Jamaica, I can't really identify thinking about the way that when I talk to my African-American peers and they're like, yeah, when I was 5, this happened. Like, I don't
Look
have.
how you just said African-American peers. See, girl, you see? Look how you just lifted.
No, because I am talking about African-American peers. Though. I'm not talking about Blacks. I'm literally talking about my African-American peers. Like, so I'm intentional.
Oh, okay. I'm so sorry.
Yeah.
Okay,
no, but what I'm comparing it to is my experience growing up in Jamaica, like with Blackness, right? And comparing it to my African-American peers growing up in the US. What I'm saying is, with conversations I've had, especially, about like when I was 5, this thing happened and this person called me X. So there's a different, like at a young age, kind of awareness. Or my darker skinned friends who had, being, people kind of bringing attention to, their darker skin or something like that. So I'm saying before I came to the US, I didn't really have those kinds of defining, like consciously thinking about Black, but I had positive, like I think about learning about Nanny of the Maroons, right, growing up in Jamaica, and how they kicked the British behind. Right. And for me, I didn't have the language of, I knew there were Black people though, you know what I'm saying? So it was a different kind of, and that's the kind of thing I teach, like I taught my daughter about it. And she was like, yeah, right. And so for me, that's also shaping that narrative around, literally when I had a party to celebrate getting tenure, I talk about Nanny of the Maroons and like the fighting spirit. And you have, that's teaching my daughter that they were smart and they outsmarted the British. Like the British had to basically like, fine, So for me, that is a positive association with Blackness, right? The connection, the impact of the Rastafarian movement in Jamaica and the kind of connectedness to Africa, and the music. And for me, I connect to, I think that's why, despite the kind of sexism within, the movement that I don't necessarily identify with, I identify very strongly with like, with reggae, not, kind of, I'm blanking for a second, but thinking about kind of cultural reggae music, right? The ones that have like, all these kind of positive affirmations about hello, Mama Africa. Oh,
give us some names so we can add to the playlist.
Like Chronix. I mean, so I'm, and also the upliftment for me, of Black women in the music. So I think my particular also kind of, I guess we think about it in the US, it might be for folks kind of thinking about the Black Panthers and Malcolm X. For me, it's like the Rastafarians, right? And then seeing the connections in, with folks in the US as well. And being from Jamaica, and Marcus Garvey is one of the 7 national heroes, okay? And so that also kind of like Pan-Africanist kind of connection, right? So I think for me, that's how a lot of this kind of positive associations with Blackness but it's kind of through Africa, right? But it's really kind of the same thing, and it's more like folks will be like, look, I'm African, right? That's what I am, and embracing that, even within the Jamaican society itself, though there are folks who may kind of internalize anti-Blackness. So within our communities, we have these kind of strands of counter narratives, right, that exist. And even though we as Black people some of us internalize certain aspects of anti-Blackness, we at least have that in a way that white people do not. And I think that's one of the things that make a difference, is that in predominantly white spaces and communities, they don't have any counter narratives to Black is bad and Black is
for sure.
Right.
Well, even not just with white people though. Like I go back to your story of your colleague who identified as a person of color, right? Who told you that the term Black was offensive.
I was calling the person non-Black to keep, be anonymous, but yeah. I'm just saying non-Black. Non-Black person.
Well, I outed them, not you. So like they can come find me on the Facebook. But I'm just saying, like, we're acknowledging the positive connections that we have, but those negative engagements of the term exist too.
Yes.
To the extent that somebody told you, a Black woman, whoa, you're using that offensive term with me. Where did that come from?
Honestly, for me, I think just as I kind of explained, within the, whether it's within the US Black community or diaspora, that because we have these kind of positive meanings, right? The Black church, like there are all these counter narratives that we have. And also we have lived experiences, right?
Yeah.
So even though we may internalize certain aspects, let's say, of the ideology of meritocracy, that says like, hey, the smartest people are the ones who are successful. And Black people internalize that too. But we also have aunties and moms and so on that, go to work and work hard and believe in hard work and all that stuff and still may not make it. Like I have people in my life who have degrees and are struggling. How many white people can say that? Right?
Yeah. I mean, I have a degree and I'm struggling. So.
No, seriously, like, so and these are folks like, they're smart, they're hardworking, all of that. So I, in my own life have examples of this, right? And I think for white folks, if everybody that is successful has a degree, all of that stuff, then it kind of lines up and there's no counter narrative. And the only people who are not doing well are the ones who aren't quote unquote smart or didn't go to school or didn't have a degree, then it matches up. But we have those counter examples within our communities, right? Of the folks who get locked up in jail, but they are smart, that is not a contradiction. And so I think the reason why it's Black and Blackness has this persistently and consistently negative associations with folks outside of the Black community is because they do not, again, have the counter narratives. They do not have lived experiences. They do not they don't interact with me. Because if you interacted with me, then I would tell you, right? Yeah. We would be having conversations where I'm like, nah, like, so they're not interacting with Black folks, really. Yeah. They're segregated in their segregated spaces. They're getting the media that are kind of socializing them with these kind of negative associations. We're in this George Floyd moment, police brutality. So these are the negative things that they're associating with us with oppression. And oppression is part of our reality, but we are not defined solely by
part of it.
The ways in which we are oppressed.
Yeah. As you were talking, I was also thinking about, you hate to tell it, right? But the ways in which Black people have also created that, like some Black people have created the negative engagement. And what I'm saying is, I'm thinking about Jay-Z's 444 album that came out a couple years ago. And he was like, I'm not Black, I'm OJ. And I feel like, he's mocking OJ, but how many Black celebrities, as they've gotten closer and closer and closer to the peak of society, want to not be called Black, right? OJ being one of those people. You get what I'm saying? And I mean, the list goes on. I don't know if Kanye has removed himself from being Black or not.
Oh, Lord.
So I'm just saying, like, there are also Black people who, in some ways, to kind of cement their own white adjacencies, have been like, oh, no, that term's not for me. Right. I'm just a human. So I think not you and I have to take ownership, but I'm just saying, even within the Black community, we also have people who have kind of framed it like, I'd rather not be associated with Black because I'm moving on up. And so I have to leave that term behind if I'm going to be successful in my upward expansion as well.
Right.
Speaking of people who are adjacent, you and I have talked about these conceptions, POC, BIPOC. And I know I have some feelings about it, and I know you have some feelings about it. So what are your thoughts? Is that something that we need to be putting on our vidas right now? Like, how are you feeling about that, Bedelia?
If you look at some of my Facebook posts, I've definitely I've had some ambivalent feelings about the term people of color. I think BIPOC helps a bit because it recognizes kind of the distinctive Black and Indigenous experience, but I don't think that that is as me. I think that's, I've seen that mostly used by my academic peers. I don't see, like I see students in my classes being kind of, right, or everyday folks kind of using people of color, but I don't see the, you know, Black Indigenous people of color used as much. And I think for me, it was, you know, let me first say that I am all for the people of color label in theory, right? Or based on its kind of original conception of political solidarity, right? And so I am absolutely, let me unequivocally state that I am absolutely for that. Right?
Okay, we know you intersectional, all right.
Yeah, no, because that's important to say though, because I think part of the issue and part of what my ambivalence stems from is that it's been used more as an identity, right? And not position of solidarity.
Yeah, that's
right.
good.
And so that, you know, I think it is important for me to say that I am definitely, you know, for the kind of like position of solidarity. I certainly have individual relationships with kind of anti-racist people of color that are, you know, strong. And so that's cool. But I think for a lot of folks, it's more that the misuse and the way that I think about it, the kind of misuse, you know, can't think of the word, but the ways in which the terminology have been kind of co-opted and misused,
yeah,
I find problematic, right? So on one hand, you know, given the conversation we've had about Blackness, a lot of people use it to just not say Black, right?
Say that. I need you to say that again, like out in the so the whole choir can hear. Not to be Black.
Yeah, a lot of people use people of color really when they mean Black, but they don't want to say it. Right?
It's like a gentler, easier way to say Black.
Yeah, you know, like,
I mean, you know, you don't want to say urban.
No, right? So it's like, you know, people of color really having a hard time, you know, with the civil police violence, you know, and, you know, protests and so on. Do you mean Black people, right? So, you know, so I don't have a problem with its usage when it's used to denote the kind of collective, you know, non-white folks, but my issue is a lot of times it's used to just not say Black, right? So that's one thing. I also am ambivalent about it because I also see it being, especially in spaces that are supposed to be created for, you know, people of color to find solidarity amongst ourselves. I see it also being used by, let's say, ethnic white folks. Okay? Because let me back it up. So in the US, right, it's not good to be racist.
That's
right?
the worst thing you can
or to be called it. Sorry, let me back it up. It is not good to be called and identified as a racist.
Yes,
even if one acts in a racist way.
Yeah, that is if you want to hurt a white person's feelings, call them racist. Like that is the worst thing to call a white person.
That is super offensive. And my point is that sometimes I think that some ethnic whites or white presenting people, which are just, you know, I think that is, you know, potentially distinct, use the term people of color as a way of kind of identifying with being part of an oppressed group, but also as a way to escape accountability for their anti-Blackness.
Yes, yes.
Right? And you know, the two things can happen. Like you can be a person of color that experiences racism in your own right, and you can also, right, internalize and perpetrate anti-Blackness. I think sometimes it's a way of kind of claiming solidarity and saying, I'm a person of color too. And I think the worst for me too is like the folks who, it's one thing, and I've definitely had colleagues who acknowledge that, look, I do identify as a person of color because I've had racialized experiences. There are times I may be thought of as white, there are times that I'm not, but I also recognize that this is a privilege. I don't really have issues, honestly, I don't really have issues with people like my colleagues like that who just kind of acknowledge that, you know, it is what it is. But I think the reason why I'm ambivalent is because I do engage with folks who use the people of color label, but really present as white in the world. And when it's time to, for them to show solidarity with me and other Black and brown folks to kind of fight against racism, all of a sudden it's like, oh, they cannot be found. When it's time to be like, I'm a victim of racism, right? Then they're all up in there, like, yeah, I'm a victim of racism. I think that's really the issue I have, right? Is the ways in which, I can't escape being a Black woman, right? And for that reason, when, stuff comes down, like, I don't have an option, in terms of like, I'm just going to like be over here in my little corner and not say anything because I'm feeling the blunt force, right, of that anti-Blackness. And for folks who could be all on on that little line and be like, I'm going to be white when it, serves my purpose, or at least, right, but I'm not going to be in solidarity with you. That really, I think, is problematic. I think for me, again, doesn't kind of apply to kind of every all folks, but I definitely see that pattern in many folks, and that also a lot of, I would say, ethnic white, right? So I'm not talking about, you were younger and you were treated like a non-white person, which I know happens to some people. I'm talking, you are Cuban, and you white, right?
Yeah.
Spaniard, you white, you Italian, you white. But they may be recent immigrants, whatever it is, and they use the people of color label because they do have experiences of what I call it, of like maybe kind of honorary white status or lower white status, right? So within the US context, right, they're white, but they're not American white. And so within the US context is American white that might have the highest kind of power, prestige, status, or what have you. And so you may experience yourself as having less power. You may feel kind of singled out with your accent or what have you. And so these kind of different experiences that you may not have had when you're in your country of origin makes you feel like, well, I'm a person of color. But really you are white. You're just not, and also the different, feeling kind of different ethnically. And I think that's a different thing too. You were different ethnically. Like I'm Jamaican, I got some Trinidadian friends that are, have some different, ethnic cultural things, right? But we're still Black, right? And so the same, and they're white Jamaicans. Just because they're Jamaican doesn't make them, that's like a white Jamaican coming here and be like, I'm a person of color. No, you're not. You're a white Jamaican.
Yeah.
And so that's also the issue that I may have with, that I have with the way that terminology sometimes gets deployed. Yeah.
I mean, I've been in spaces personally and professionally where I didn't even know the person was a person of color until a certain conversation happened. And I'm like, oh. Because going back to that right presenting, like you're living your life right presenting, non-racialized, until in some ways it's convenient to say, oh, by the way, right, I'm also ethnic. I've experienced a lot of I've experienced a lot of interpersonal violence by way of people of color. Right? We see it on social media all the time. People who identify as Hispanic, Latinx, whatever, but just, South Asian, all these different groups who are adamantly anti-Black. And so when I see the term POC, it's a little triggering because it feels like this is a non-Black person who will use having a minority status as a way to be less direct with their racism. Like you can't say I'm racist. Yeah. And so I'm at a point now with everything that's happening in our very anti-Black world where I don't want to be associated with the term. That's where I'm at today. You know what I'm saying? Because even with everything that's been happening with George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, I feel like a lot of POCs are engaging in anti-Black behavior. And at a point where, like you said, we're supposed to be looking for this political solidarity, it doesn't exist. Or you're redirecting the conversation around your particular type of struggle. And so right now that term feels really violent to me. It might not feel like that 3 months from now or 6 months from now, but today it feels like a violent term.
I also want to say, like institutions, right? I think it's really important to pay attention to this, because I think that this is also one way that like we were talking about it interpersonally, and that resonates with us. But institutions also use that, the ways in which institutions use that term to also escape accountability or paying attention to Black issues and the particular kind of debt that they owe Black folks that they may not have, to other folks. So I'm thinking about, and I talked about this experience in a podcast that I did a few months ago about when, I was considering private schools for my daughter, and I visited these Montessori schools. And these Montessori schools were, I was really impressed by the fact that at least a third of the students were students of color, right? Quite diverse compared to some of the other ones, where it's literally one or two in a classroom, right? So the fact that within a classroom, at least a third of the students were students of color was amazing to me, right? But here's the thing, even within that 1/3, there was still only like one Black kid. And that one Black kid was probably, there may be like a, what they call kind of a racially ambiguous child or something like that. And honestly, based on conversations that I would have in those spaces, I wonder who that Black kid is. Like, is that the kid of a Jamaican immigrant? I'm gonna be real, because when I talk about, because I remember having, because that, came up in a conversation with one of the directors or what have you, and they're like, oh, because I wanted to talk. What I asked was, could I have the information of another Black parent so I can talk to, right, about their experiences? And she was like, oh, there's a Jamaican couple that you could talk to, Or when I'm trying to push them on, what do you do, or what will you do to make sure that my Black child feels safe? Then it's like, oh, we provide a space for them to express their cultural identity, And I'm just like, look, I can teach my child about how to be Jamaican at home. What I'm trying to get you to understand is, what are you going to do to make sure that her Blackness does not become a problem in this space? I think the way, again, that institutions, you grapple onto that term, because they also, that school also was touting in their video how diverse they are, right? So institutions can tout how diverse they are, and on the surface, like, because a third, I think that is a big deal, but that kind of glosses over the fact that where are the Black people?
No, they're not there,
right? But I think a lot of institutions, that's an example of kind of K through 12, but it also happens in higher ed as well.
Yeah, and I was just about to say, that the same stuff happens on our institutions, right? Mm-hmm. You get what I'm saying? In some ways, our higher ed administrators will loudly proclaim how many people of color, how many faculty of color exist on campus. But a lot of those faculty colors, like you said, are actually white presenting, white ethnic. And then we're talking about groups of people who, if we're talking about the United States, have been enfranchised into whiteness since the Industrial Revolution, right? So I think it's important to recognize that there's a lot of nuance. And when people see that term POC, hopefully one of the things they'll start to do is recognize that nuance exists.
Right.
Because even as we're moving towards hopefully a less anti-racist society, eliminating anti-Blackness, like, people are having these conversations about racism, and I do feel like it's a safe way not to say Black, like you mentioned. And so, I think we just need to move forward, but definitely we need to recognize that everyone is seeing that term the same. I think that's what we're getting to, that everyone doesn't have that same association.
Right.
So speaking of like terms that have been used to identify Black people, or not to say Black, right? In the early 90s, Jesse Jackson came along and was like, hey, Black people, y'all should be African American, because it'll be a reminder, Africa. Like, if Jesse Jackson sees this video, I'm not trying to disrespect you, but the idea of like this like ethnic heritage, like, hey, we have one, and I know for a while I subscribed to that term African American, but honestly, in some ways it feels like that term was still about highlighting the American part, not the African part. Because if you're going to go around and decide that the millions of Black people who live in the United States are African American and not provide resources that connect them to that larger African ancestry, then it's in name only, which is my position, right? I can't tell you when I stopped using the term, but I know that I never felt good about it. It always felt like a swindle on some level, like I was being bamboozled. I just didn't understand to what extent. As a Jamaican immigrant, do you feel like, I would assume that people have used that term with you, but do you feel connected to it? Okay. Yeah. So do you feel connected, disconnected? What do you think that term even means in our now?
So I know that people in the US, because I think this is a US cultural thing. I think Black, white, whatever, my experience is that people in the US use Black and African American interchangeably. And as a Black immigrant, I actually have problems with that, right?
Wow.
Because I am Black, but I'm not African American. I do think of African American as an ethnic term, to refer to Black people in the US. And just like I would say, you're Guyanese, you are Jamaican, you are African, like that's how I see it, as like one of the African descended or part of the diaspora, right, in the US. And so, that's why, like, when I say African American, I mean it very specifically for Black people in the US. I never use it when I just mean Black. And I do have people who might refer to me as African American. Now, the truth is, though, I don't always correct people. This is why, right? It depends on context. Because again, I came to the US when I was 12, but it's like it takes, you learn race. Like for me, it's like learning race is a real thing. More, as an immigrant than folks who are kind of like born and socialized into it. And so if people were to call me African American, to me that's just like an Italian calling someone who is Italian French and them saying, no, I'm not French, I'm Italian, right? Like literally. And I remember it like the experience I had when I was in grad school. I think it was at a club, or, I don't know how it happened, but I remember a Black woman, referred to me as such, and I corrected her, right? Like literally innocently. And the look on her face, my God. But what I took from that afterwards was like, oh my goodness, because I realized that because it is used interchangeably, that if I am to say that to a Black person who doesn't know me, that they're interpreting that as, or African American person who doesn't know me, they're interpreting that as saying, I'm not Black, I don't wish to be associated with you, because there are also immigrant folks who do that.
Wow.
And so for me, that was really powerful, and I decided, so for me, if I am in a situation with other Black folks that don't know me, right, like a one-time thing, and they refer to me as African American, I actually made the decision not to correct them, because at that moment, it does, like, they're trying to connect with me and build solidarity. And if I'm never going to see them again, like, I just don't see like what it serves for me to correct them in that moment. And so I will do it to my friends, like my African American friends, I will do that. Because we also have ongoing conversations to unpack, right, what that means. I may do it with my work colleagues. Again, we can have a conversation about what that means. And I will definitely do it with white folks. And I do it in my classrooms, because we also have an opportunity to kind of unpack. But if I'm at some kind of social event with Black folks and I'm referred to as African American, I just don't see, for the sake of like solidarity, if I don't have time to explain what that means, why I would correct them. But that's essentially how, I feel about it. And so, I get that within the community that people identify differently with that term, with the terminology. But for me, I actually do prefer to use African American when I'm specifically talking about Black folks with a history in the US, because I think about that more as an ethnic term. And I do take issues with when people use it interchangeably with Black. And when I use Black, I think that does signify kind of solidarity, right? Like, I'm Black, you're Black, we're got dropped off different places. But for the most part, that signifies a kind of connection to Africa kind of thing. So that's kind of my my whole approach to that.
Well, thanks for giving me that knowledge, because that's definitely a nuanced understanding the term that I never had until being in connection with you. You said something that I think is powerful, that Black means solidarity. And so, we know that language creates reality. So do you think that the term Black on a global level does create a sense of solidarity across the diaspora?
I think with specific communities, honestly, I think it's hard to just maybe identify a place. Like, as I think it depends, right? And I think that there are, so if you think about whether it's thinking about Latin America and the Caribbean and so on, I think for Jamaicans, I think, yes, I think we think of it, but we're a Black nation, right? I think that there are other places where it's much more nuanced, right? Especially when the dominant narrative in that country is to kind of deny one's Blackness or have a narrative around we're just mixed up, like we're just mixed kind of thing.
Yeah.
So I think, it's hard for me to say kind of explicitly, but I think it really depends. Like if we're talking about, let's say, Cuba and Black folks within that really kind of practice Santeria and like identify with a connection to Africa, then so that clearly is a yes, right? But there may be other folks who do not. So I think also thinking about the fact that globally there is this kind of negative stigma associated with Blackness, and so I can see in spaces where, especially if the national identity is kind of like the salient one, that people might have different engagements with it. So it's hard for me to just say kind of within the diaspora, right? But certainly, thinking about the George Floyd moment and protesting that's happening in the US, I think when we see Black nations saying like, yeah, we're going to protest, I think that is definitely them, in Kenya or Nigeria, I think that is definitely them identifying like, those are our people.
Yeah, right?
I thought anyway. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I love the idea because of how fragmented we are as descendants of Africans, to find those things that unite us despite the fact that we have been so fractured by external forces,
right?
And I love the idea that Black could be one of those things. You said about you mentioned with what's going on in the United States. Some people are saying the language that I'm seeing is like, this is the new civil rights movement. And so I guess the first question, like I've been thinking about, is do I agree that that's where we are right now? Are we experiencing a new civil rights movement? And so I'm going to pose that question to you, but my response to that is kind of to borrow terminology we see happening in feminism, is I wouldn't necessarily, Kina wouldn't articulate it as a new civil rights movement. I would maybe call it a new wave in the existing movement, right? Because, a lot of times people talk about the civil rights movement in the United States starting in the 60s, and I'm always the person who's like, actually, we have proof as early as the 1930s of Black people working, engaging in social activism to insist on their humanity and rights. So I would say that, there's different waves of civil rights movement. I would say the first piece of civil rights legislation in this country wasn't the 1965 Civil Rights Act signed by Lyndon B. Johnson. I would actually say we could argue that the first piece of civil rights legislation might have actually been the 13th Amendment. I mean, I don't need people to agree with me, but you know what I'm saying? Like, so my response to that is, this is another wave of the movement. What are your thoughts? Do you think that we're in a new civil rights movement?
I think I've gotten that question maybe in different ways in terms of like what's different about what's happening. And I'll be honest, like I don't have a set answer. I'm a little ambivalent because my first reaction is to really feel like I'm stuck in a time warp, right? As I'm thinking, especially as I'm thinking specifically about police violence against Black people, like I remember my first kind of consciousness of this, even thinking about my own lifetime. I'm not even going back to like Emmett Till before it, before like 1992. Like I'm starting with, 92, Rodney King, and that was my first kind of consciousness in the US. And I still think it was still kind of had a different meaning at the time, because it was literally like, I think I might have been in the country only a couple of years. But I'm thinking about that, and I'm thinking about, Amadou Diallo. I'm thinking about other, since then, there seems to be kind of like a cycle and a spiral every few, not even every few years, because now it seems to be rapid fire, like boom,
yeah,
boom, boom,
every
boom,
couple days. Yeah.
yeah. And so as I think about that, I see more kind of like history repeating itself. And then as, that happens, kind of builds up, and then a kind of uprising of like enough is enough, right? So on the one hand, I see it as, history repeating itself, and also because I know that those structures are there. And, for us sociologists, we talk about the ways in which racism kind of morphs and change and evolves over time and manifests in different ways. And also I'm a pessimist, so, there's that. So there's that. But I also think about the global kind of reaction that I don't think that I've seen before, but I also think that might be related to the reach of social media, the global, the ways in which we can get information, kind of across the world, right, in short periods of time. I think that has something to do with it, but that may be kind of different. And is it possible that, the US might be shamed, right? Thinking about also Derek Bell's concept of interest convergence, right? Because I think he also makes an argument around the civil rights movement, the board, Brown versus Board of Education in particular, like, yeah, that happened because, it served white people's interests. He makes a longer argument about, Black people getting rights only when it converges with the interests of white people.
Yeah.
Right. And that white people are willing to always sacrifice our needs and interests, for their own. And so as I think about the global kind of show of support, I'm wondering, like, could that be kind of, an opportunity for interest convergence? But also the person who's in the White House actually doesn't really care about being called a racist in a way. Right? So maybe someone else would have been shamed into like, oh, I don't want to be called that. But this is someone who outwardly like identifies and calls white supremacists and hires white supremacists, people with white supremacist ties, in his organization. So, so I guess my thing is like, I'm not quite ready to say that it is, but I think it's also, Black people resist. And I think that's also part of the, right? So there's a wave of oppression, but there's also a wave of us resisting. And I think that's also kind of one of those lessons I want my daughter to know about. Like, yeah, like we don't just sit here and take it, right? Like we got the spirit of Nanny of the Maroons in us. And so like, that's gonna come back at you. Right? So, yeah.
And a part of that resistance, I think, it goes back to the term Black.
Yeah.
Like when we think about Stokely Carmichael, do you understand the Black Power movement, the Black Panthers? So much of what resistance was understood as was marked by Black.
Yes.
So even in this new era, whatever we want to call it, Black Lives Matter is at the center of that, right? And so what does it mean that that term Black gets situated into a space and it creates this automatic like, oh, hell no, right? Like, and so I think like, whether we are or aren't in the new civil rights movement, I think that term Black means something in those spaces. Yeah.
I mean, it means resistance. And I think going back to what it means, I think that's also one of the reasons why for white folks it's kind of like, oh, color.
Oh, they do some Black stuff.
African American. they will hire an African American over, Black person.
when Black show up, people are like, woo.
Yeah. Anyway.
All right. So, I know you're really engaged in talks around race, talks around anti-racism. That's what your platform does. I'm so excited to support you. My project, the Anti-Blackness Reader, is a digest of information, but also a kind of a critique of how anti-Blackness functions in the world. And so I think we both agree that anti-Blackness is a significant component in addressing anti-racism. What do we need people to know about that right now in this moment that we're having in the United States, that it's not just about anti-racism?
I mean, I don't, yeah, so I hear what you're saying. I guess I don't necessarily back it up. I think when we think about anti-racism, that we definitely have to think about, just as the story that I just told about the way that people of color can kind of camouflage and erase and make us kind of gloss over anti-Blackness, that racism is definitely bad, and this is something we should kind of fight against. There are ways in which it manifests, like very specifically, right? And thinking about the history of the way that Blackness has kind of served as the thing that white folks look at as like the base of the U.S. kind of, like we have always kind of been at the blunt force, right? It's like if Blackness is the opposite of whiteness, if Blackness is kind of, it helps to kind of define, Blackness is also, quite frankly, when we think about the model minority, right? Like it is also kind of a implicit way of like, you know, you don't want to be Black, you want to be this, right? And so the ways in which all other groups are kind of defined in relation to Blackness, that if we don't really kind of address anti-Blackness, then we can't really address, right, racism, or we can't really be completely anti-racist if we don't address anti-Blackness, like in particular.
Yeah, and I think Black is also a server, like it serves as a basis to even understand who's human and who isn't. Mm-hmm. Right, like who's deserving of a certain amount of humanity, dignity, and value in relationship to where they fall on this ladder of Blackness.
Right. Yeah. Because
and that's a whole nother conversation about colorism too. You know what I'm saying? Like the lighter your skin is, the more perceivable kindness or thoughtfulness or regard you might even get. Right.
It's so actually a metric for humanity, right? So if you think about a ruler or whatever, like we use to kind of measure things, and Blackness is kind of like at the bottom of like that metric of like how human you are, right?
And so that means that people can't do this work without #please say Black.
Yes. Well, you can't, you can't fix the problem without identifying. Well, yeah, you can't have a solution for a problem if you don't actually identify what the problem is and diagnose it properly. So yeah.
Exactly. So I want you to give us your final thoughts and tell us more about your platform before we go today.
So again, I am the founder of RaceTalk LLC. I think of that as kind of, tools for racial justice. And that's also why, for me, language matters, right? Because to have a conversation about being anti-racist, about anti-Blackness, we have to be very accurate with the terminology that we use. I really want folks to not erase, Black people and Black people's struggles. And that if for folks who are really about this work, right? Because I also see some of my colleagues who may have good intentions, also beyond that, people of color, colleague of color kind of language. So I'm really encouraging folks to please say Black, right? Because, saying it makes it visible, right? Not saying it keeps it in the shadows and prevents us actually being able to addressing it. And so, for those who care about Black folks, who want to be allies with Black folks, then don't be afraid, right? And if you are afraid, if it makes you uncomfortable, then maybe sit with that discomfort and kind of interrogate it, and think about why, right, you have that discomfort. But recognize that for many of us who identify and embrace the concept of Black, that we are not just, right, our oppression. Right?
Yeah. Well, Bedelia, thank you for teaching me, encouraging me, affirming my position. If no one else believes me, you do.
Yes, I do. Thank you, Kina. I really appreciate you inviting me into this space. You know that I have long admired you. I've said that to you. And that we may have minor differences, but for the most part, like, we're on the same page about this. And I love the fact that also, like I know that you will hold me accountable, right? When need be.
Well, that's what Black women do.
Yes, that's what we do. That's what we do.
All right.
All right.
Again.
All right. Bye-bye.